This episode, I'm joined by Mazviita Chirimuuta to discuss her book, The Brain Abstracted: Simplification in the History and Philosophy of Neuroscience, alongside discussions on Lebensphilosophy and the limitations of science. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything going, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Mazviita Chirimuuta, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast. We're going to be discussing your book, The Brain Abstracted: Simplification in the History and Philosophy of Neuroscience, which was published by MIT Press last year, 2024. This is a book about the limits and definition of science. It's also about philosophy of mind. It's also about consciousness, the mind-body problem. But it also draws on Lebensphilosophy, theology, God, and quite a lot of other things. It's a very robust book. And I think even before we've started talking, I've made it clear to you how difficult it has been to sculpt the questions for this. So we're going to focus sort of on the more philosophical side of the book and how Nietzsche, specifically the death of God and the death of science and the limitations of science and what it is to be beyond science, if that's possible, how this relates to your work more broadly. But it is a very original book, very unique book. So please tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and the origins of The Brain Abstracted.
Hi, James. Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me to your podcast. And, well, the origins of the book, I would say originally sort of stemmed from when I was studying visual neuroscience myself. So my PhD is not in philosophy. It's actually in from a physiology department, but I wasn't doing physiological experiments. I was actually doing a kind of psychology of vision known as psychophysics, where you take precise measurements of people's visual thresholds, and we were trying to build computational models which would predict the visual thresholds in terms of theories of what's going on in primary visual cortex, which is a bit of sensory cortex at the back of your head there. It takes signals from the eye and passes them up to other parts of the brain. So I was sort of fascinated by neuroscience in my early career precisely because of the promise of explaining mental processes like vision in terms of what we knew about the operations of the small populations of neurons, and the extent to which we could also use computers as a way to figure out what's going on in the brain. And so a lot of the book sort of goes back to issues that I was first thinking about back then, that's 20 years ago now, which is about the nature of computational explanation and how mathematics is a way to make complex things more simple. What are the justifications of that? Why we draw analogies between the computer and the brain? I would say back then, and the way I was trained, I was much more of a, if you like, a computational realist. I was sort of quite happy with sort of assimilating brain processes to computational processes. I was quite enthusiastic about the explanatory promise of that. And over the years, I became more critical. So it's a kind of a 20 years kind of development into a position in which I say computational explanations and methodology sort of fine within science, but there's big problems about interpreting them philosophically, kind of beyond the science, treating them as, if you like, a fundamental theory of what the brain and ultimately the mind is.
Was philosophy always there in the background for you? Or was there a key moment where you thought, okay, I've sort of just noticed the limits of what we're doing here, and there is a gap where this doesn't reach?
Yeah, actually philosophy was always in the background. So my first degree was in philosophy and psychology, and I wanted to study philosophy when I was still at school because I was interested in these big questions about the world and how they link to empirical sciences as well. So it was precisely curiosity about how perception works, and perception being our sort of window onto reality. So thinking, if there's scientific both explanations of perception, both from psychology and from neuroscience, that is a huge philosophically significant part of empirical science that I wanted to know more about.
So you didn't, this is a very heavy philosophical question very early on, but does that mean from fairly early on, did you consider yourself somewhat of an analytical Kantian? An acceptant of the conditions that Kant lays out with regard to the transcendental aesthetic?
Yeah. So I think actually fairly early on in my childhood, I became bothered that I couldn't be a naive realist about perception. So interestingly, my mother's an ophthalmologist, so she likes talking about the eyes and how vision works, and the thought that there's all of this process that happens between you and reality. So what is reality really? Do we ever actually access that? So yeah, I guess I was from childhood a bit of a Kantian.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that the gap or the limitation is something more to do with the conditions themselves?
So I don't think now that we should think of perceptual processes as a barrier between us and reality, so much as there's something wrong with the thought that knowledge should be this completely unmediated access to things. So I'm much more comfortable with the idea that the human situation is one in which we're part of the world and we know the world through the way that we interact with things, so that we can't have a God's eye view on reality or this completely unmediated access. So I'm happy with that now, but it took a long time from my early shock about naive realism might not be possible. Of course, I didn't use those words, but I do remember in a playground looking at the line cast by a shadow on the ground and then asking myself, okay, which of those two greys is the real grey of the concrete? And my first book, Outside Colour, was on the problem of colour ontology, actually, and whether seeing colours is actually a grand illusion, as various philosophers have tried to argue.
Well, I'm too intrigued to not ask, in response to that. I mean, which is the real grey of those two? As your research?
So what I say in the colour book is that they're both real greys.
Okay.
But grey is not a mind-independent property of the concrete in itself that we somehow get access to. The grey that we perceived as conditioned, at least in part by away.
So, I mean, not to jump to the end of the discussion in a way, but it seems that your initial impetus for philosophy, in getting engaged in neuroscience, was to answer questions, and that the answer that has arisen from that is that there is a certain point where you will not know. So you are a scientist who is somehow, or a philosophical scientist who is somehow trying to find a middle way, which is placing itself in the limitation. But would not many scientists say, well, that's absolutely not what science is meant to be? If we can't know, then what's the point? If there is admittance of not being able to know, then that isn't, many would argue that isn't science. I'll play devil's advocate there.
Yeah. So that science has some inherent limits. This is very much a Kantian theme. That what we need to do as thinkers, as philosophers, the task of philosophy of science. And I think of Kant's critical project. What I get from it now as a philosopher of science is that side of it, thinking about the constitution of scientific knowledge and maybe some inherent limits to it. I know there are many other ways that one can take Kant and get different things from him, but that's what resonates with me now. So it's not anti-intellectual or anti-science. I think Kant was in many ways a kind of science worshipper in his own way. But he shows us that it's important to raise those questions. Another thinker who I kept reading a certain piece of his over and over again the years that I was writing on the book. Is a neuroscientist, Emile Dubois-Raymond, who was working in Germany, like mid-19th to late 19th century. He's credited with being the first person to record action potentials in the nerves. He was a friend and collaborator with Hermann von Helmholtz, and very much in this like mechanistic anti-vitalist tradition of German biology at that time, but also schooled in Kantianism. And he has this very controversial public lecture that he gave, über die Grenzen des Naturkennens, so on the limits of our knowledge of nature. And in it, he presents the hard problem of consciousness as this problem that neurophysiology will never be able to resolve. And people were really scandalized by him because they saw him as this kind of hard-nosed reductionist physiologist who shouldn't entertain the question that there is a problem that cannot be resolved through these hard-nosed scientific methods. But yeah, he was saying, no, there may be things that go beyond the limits of what we can do with these methods. And so culturally, it was controversial, but it doesn't mean he was any less of a fan of science. So I think it's a shame that these honest intellectual questions get cast as, are you pro-science or anti-science? And then it takes on this whole like culture war connotations around that.
There's so much, and it's also let's use the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which
is not something that I'm working on.
No. Oh, okay.
Don't have any insight into it.
Oh, okay. Well, you mentioned it, so I was going to possibly use it as an example of where to pinpoint sort of the meta level where what is going on with the mind reaches, but it seems very paradoxical, right? The mind has to reach a point where it cannot go beyond it. So to ask an abstract, arguably a philosophical question, what does that point look like? If it's a point, what is that to you, that barrier? Because it's the only apparatus we have to assess that barrier. It's almost like a Zen koan at the moment, is the mind itself.
Right. Yes, and this is, precisely the point at which Hegel, wasn't it? And I have no claims to understand Hegel, but as much as
no one does.
Yeah. But anyway, Hegel sort of pointed out like the massive problem with transcendental idealism, because by positing a limit, you're already going beyond it. So how can you claim to chat these limits? But in the book, not in relation to the hard problem of consciousness, I do talk about sort of limits to scientific understanding, actually, within neuroscience, sort of way before you're trying to tackle consciousness, just to do with the complexity of the thing that neuroscientists are trying to understand. So I say that in so many ways, the brain is an exceedingly complicated organ of the body. It's extremely heterogeneous and it's extremely changeable. So neuroplasticity is this physiological process, many different facets of it, but it's behind the fact that we have memories, that our experience changes us from day to day. Our brains are never the same from day to day. I call this the Heraclitean brain. There's a chapter of the book. And this is like self-consciously harking back to the pre-Socratics that was invoked in this era of Lebens philosophy or life philosophy, as there was this big insight there at the dawn of philosophy that nature is flux, and that this presents us with an inherent limitation to conceptualization. And this is there in the Cratylus and Platonic dialogue, and then gets picked up again in this late 19th century era and post-Kant. So if nature really is this Heraclitean flux and conceptual thought relies on being able to treat things as static objects, to be able to say that the properties of any one thing are determinate, it's either that thing or it's not that thing. If things are changeable, they're always neither nor, or maybe, or a bit like that, but not quite like that. And so there's a mismatch between, if you like, the rigidity of conceptual thought and the fluidity of nature. And this was a big theme, not just with Nietzsche, but with Bergson, and it was picked up by orthodox neo-Kantians like Cassirer. It really shapes how someone like Cassirer, who's, again, one of these his big project is to defend scientific knowledge, but he has this very much in the background that what science is doing is bringing order and a kind of rigidity of conceptual architecture to something which is more dynamic and kind of harder to pin down. Yeah.
Science is after the fact, but treats itself as if it's the genesis of those facts in describing them.
I would say the less Kantian, less sort of critical philosophy and this is how scientists normally operate in scientific realism and like popular discourse normally goes, is that no, science is not the originator of this. It takes itself to just be simply reading off an order which is there in nature anyway, whereas actually it's bringing order to bear on something which is much more fluid and complex.
That seems I mean, do you agree with that? Because it seems, from my point of view, someone who's spent so much time in philosophy, that it's all just, I'm just at the stage where it's all collapsing now. It's very fun. It seems...
But, sorry, what's collapsing?
Knowledge. I don't think we can know anything now.
Okay.
Being's great. But I know I'm sort of, I mean, because that's what I'm reading at the moment, it seems to me that what you're talking about in terms of the Heraclitean brain, putting this in relation to science is sort of sovereignty is resting on an almost Edenic descriptive faculty of, if only we can describe this, and in that is scientific knowledge of like knowing it down to the most finite molecule and labeling everything. If only we can know that, then we have order. But it seems to me that the order is already there. The thing that is being described, the thing that is being known, is already such, and it's only this sort of labeling descriptive process of science that comes after the fact, that seems to then is very much a map territory type split. Yeah. Where was I going with that? But it's what I was going to say was that at that point, when you hone in on it and the limits of that, and I guess the relationship between ontology and knowing to such a degree, you enter into a sort of form of mysticism, because what else do you have? You can't retreat to the knowing of science, of the faculties of reason, because they immediately get caught up in the self-same machinations of scientific description. And so where else can you go? It seems you can only go outside of the mind, which is ontology. Sorry, I was rambling.
So if your ideal of knowing is knowing the inner self, knowing this something which is immediate and, if you like, unadulterated by conceptual thought, once you've given up the idea that like the reality has a conceptual structure and we can just mirror it, then yeah, the only path from there, if that's what you want, that kind of knowledge, then it would seem like you would have to become a mystic. You would have to say, whatever knowledge is, it's ineffable. Give up conceptual thought, and then we'll get to it. And someone like William James is often taken to be going in that direction. So he was another philosopher of that period who, when he talked about the stream of thought, he was talking about this Heraclitean flux, and this is a theme not just in the stream of thought, but in various ways in his epistemology and his ontology. You see these processual ideas come up and these views about the limitations of conceptual schematizations, and he's often taken to be a kind of mystic. Bergson had this idea of intuition as opposed to the intellect being our mode of access to this ineffable reality. And I don't think Bergson is so much of a mystic. He wasn't so focused on religious experience, or anyway, I haven't picked up that that's a big dimension in his work. But you can also just stay orthodox Kantian and just say that this idea of going beyond the doors of our conceptualization is a misguided thing anyway, and that's precisely what Cassirer was up to. So he took his opposition to Bergson as pretty foundational to his project in his major theoretical work, which is the third volume of the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, called the Phenomenology of Cognition. It's a bit of a tribute to Hegel.
And is that where you find yourself sitting? Is that the noumenon will always remain the orthodox Kantian noumenon?
Yeah. I mean, of course, some people read Kant as a mystic. I was actually curious about this, and I spent some time reading a text by Duprel, who was...
Duprel, yeah.
Yeah, who has this thing, Kant as a mystic. I didn't know what to make of that. But it was a lot about Kant's thing on Swedenborg, wasn't it? So anyway, I wouldn't want to say that there's not that direction already in Kantianism, because obviously some people take it in that way. But as a philosopher of science, I was, especially as I was writing the book, I was sort of happy to stay within that Caesura position, which I found helpful. So right at the start that I was serious about working on this project back in 2018, that was when I started reading Caesura. I'd been interested in various of his contemporaries precisely because they seem to have insightful things to say about the nature of scientific abstraction and idealization. And I'd never read Caesura before, but someone put me onto him, and I said, oh yeah, this is really helpful ways to think through some of the issues.
Okay, very broad question. So where does, as you mentioned, sort of the intuition from Bergson, and these other, we could maybe split it out as quantity versus quality, that's the classic split. Where does Liebig's philosophy come in for you? Where is the entryway for that? As it's a strange that it turns up in a book such as yours.
Yeah, well, I think the entryway was because I was interested in these questions of abstraction and idealization. So that got me to looking at this era. So Husserl was another person that I haven't got to grips with, that had enough of a background in phenomenology, but I was interested in what was going on in crisis texts and was reading some of the secondary literature on that. His whole thing about Galileo and idealization and sort of covering the life world with the garb of ideas and mathematization as being something that sort of gets us out of touch with the life world as opposed to sort of revealing a deeper reality. So there's all of this constellation of thinkers, and it just seems that so much of this is in dialogue with or prompted by Leibniz's philosophy, which is just part of that cultural moment. Yeah. And I find it almost strange that it's been forgotten, I think largely by philosophers of science and people trained in philosophy now, unless you have a particular historical interest. These diagnoses of the nature of knowledge, this antagonism between like science and reality and science and life, that has sort of dropped out of discussion. And I think one of the things I wanted to do with the book is actually put that back in discussion.
Do you think one of the reasons that Liebig's philosophy was somewhat forgotten is because science sort of, whatever we understand science to be, is our, dare I say it, our God, lower G God of the modern world? It is that which we look to at some future elusive point be able to explain everything.
Yeah, so that to the extent that one of the themes of Leibniz's philosophy was this discussion of limitations and of the intellect and conceptualization, scientific thought, then yes, it's been, I would say, more frowned upon to put that in discussion. Whether it's because science has become a god. I mean, I don't know. One of the things I would say is that it's become a sort of point of fixed order, almost fixed value of authority. It's very hard to come to terms with this idea that you do not have those. That's like Nietzsche's big point, that we're more likely to be incomplete nihilists than complete nihilists, because most people won't get with the idea that there really are no fixed points. Even if they become atheists, they'll still have some kind of substitute ordering to reality. So yeah, I think as he predicted, science became that thing to offset the idea of cosmic chaos.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit all over the place here. Just to jump back to Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Because this is fairly key in terms of what you wanted to discuss. This death of God for you, well, generally as Nietzsche understood it, but you mentioned that this is one of the sort of oversights of even Nietzsche scholarship, is that the death of God does lead to the death of science, but we're somehow still holding on, as you said, to some ordering system.
Yeah, so by the death of science, I mean science understood in what he would call the Platonic tradition of there is a underlying order of reality, there are forms, they're mathematized, they have a mathematical essence, and this is how Galileo and later mathematical physicists talk, and there's still people like that. They're like self-consciously Pythagorean about reality. There's so much Platonism around today. Sorry that going off on a tangent. But the point being that science understood as the way that we will get to this underlying ordered reality that is behind the flux of appearance, which is not the proper target of knowledge anyway, because it's too fluid. I think Nietzsche would have said, no, the two have to die together. So the God that created this order and the idea that there is that order, which is mind independent, and just there, that's reality. We just somehow need to get to it. But he wasn't anti-scientific, but for him, what we should embrace is that there is technology. There is ways that we have of exerting ourselves on the world, and that can overlap in its activities with what we nowadays call science. But that we should be more cognizant of the fact that what we're really doing is technology and not just like discovering the blueprint for the universe.
So there's too much play. You seem very animated. There's too much Platonism around today.
Too much Platonism.
Is it? What do you mean? What do you?
At which I became animated.
You seemed visibly upset at the amount of Platonism in the world. Why is this so upsetting to you?
I was saying to a colleague the other day, I'm a very conflicted Platonist, I think, still. I dislike this discourse that you get coming from physicists and also people in machine learning today that are very, very hardcore mathematical realists, and it leads to this view that anything you want to say about anything, if it's not in equations, it's not worth saying. And it's this kind of priesthood of people that know the equations and they are in touch with reality and no one else does. And I think that's the descendant of Platonism that upsets me.
You seem to hold a very unique position, because I was talking to someone just the other day about the interesting overlap of pathways. So you get many people who begin in philosophy and then they find actually that these questions can be answered by physics. You get people who begin in physics and then that's a common one, is all in physics and then move to philosophy. You seem to have holding multiple areas within their bounds, without sort of attending to a single one as anything supreme, other than of course God, which we've yet to mention, which is going to complicate things massively. But do you see that as a key area, key error perhaps of the mind, arguably of the mind, or the way we approach things that might be an error that's actually developed from science, a sort of single-mindedness that one will find their genre and that will answer all questions?
I think I admire people who are single-minded. I think I tend to look at my own sort of postulation of activities and just say, well, that's somewhat dilettantish and unfortunate, because I think it leads to some kind of lack of coherence in my own mind, because I switch between different modes of thinking about things and understanding things. But maybe it just gives me a kind of humility about the possibilities of any one of those ways. So I don't know. I don't set, or like, this is just to say, I don't set this up as a norm for other people to follow. It's probably just an accident of my biography and my tendency not to specialize. Yeah, and the thing about sort of mathematical knowledge, it's just I maybe somewhat unusually, because someone that trained in science for so long, I was really not a mathematical. My natural bent of mind is not thinking mathematically, but I sort of forced myself to do it as long as I could, that I needed to just know a bit of neuroscience. And then, so I think it puts me in a slightly odd position, because I think there are way more people in computational neuroscience whose natural bent of mind is to think everything through mathematically, and they're really good at that, and they're the people that probably stay in that discipline. But I've kind of had this outsider's perspective. Well, yes, that's one way of thinking about things, but it's not the whole story, because it's not my natural tendency of mind to look at things in that way. I kind of forced myself into it just to play that game for a while.
These all seem like corridors of different conceptual avenues, all in the same line, though, in terms of description. I don't know, maybe that's just me, it's my own bias. I want to bring in, it's a huge question, and I'm sorry for it being so haphazard, but where does God come in for you in your book?
God comes in as an explanation for why scientists have just assumed that nature is intelligible, that nature is inherently simple. So this is part of this Platonic thing that I was upset about a moment ago. Just this assumption that there is this order of intelligibility, and we can represent it mathematically, and just like the blueprint of the universe is just something that we can fit into our finite minds, and then the justification is given for that. So in the piece that I wrote more recently, I have quotations from Galileo, arguing that when we're doing mathematical proofs, our mind is doing something godlike. And look, nature is written in the book of, nature is the book written with the language of mathematics and geometry. So just that there is this jump from ideas about God and the Imago Dei to, okay, well, we can just figure everything out. There's no limits to what we can understand in the natural world. It upsets me because I think it does lead to this culture of hubris, that not recognizing that actually things could be way more complicated than is apparent, because not noticing that things are not looking simple because they inherently are simple, but they're looking simple to the scientists because it's being kind of forced to go in that direction. And this happens so much in biology when I talk about experimental controls as an example of this, that you can make organisms yield phenomena that yield very clean explanations, very mathematically tractable, but precisely with experimental situations, sort of fixing things so that only certain phenomena and interactions will show themselves. But then if you take that to mean, well, that's all there is to this living system, then you're vastly underestimating all of the other ways that it will interact with things. And I think, the real world consequences of that, you see all the time, unintended consequences of interventions, precisely because people have assumed, oh, well, this simple model has got it all nailed down, but there's actually way more to the story than that.
So again, that's the issue really is that we live in a Heraclitean world, that we can't pin it down because it's ever in flux. Which, well, Heraclitus in relation
But
to
there'll be islands of control within that. So John Dewey is an interesting figure in this respect because he was very similar to the Nietzschean position on this, that, there is no inherent order of intelligibility in the way that people had construed on that Platonic tradition. All of our knowledge making happens by way of our interventions on things, but he embraced the idea that we will never know how things were absent our interventions. But he was very optimistic about the promise of technology and how things could just be made to unfold as we would like. And the idea that we will make things intelligible for ourselves precisely through our activity on the world. He thought that there wasn't a limitation to the possibilities with that process. I think speaking 100 years later and seeing how things have sort of panned out in reality, you can see this idea that, okay, we'll just bend things to our will. Well, no, because you can't just keep things under control in the way that he imagined. Yeah.
So when we're bending things to our will, what is it we're doing? We're conflating our overly complexified knowledge with the simplicity that isn't really that simple, but
I wouldn't say that the knowledge is over complexified. I would say that it tends to underestimate how sensitive and changeable things are.
I'm not sure where to go from here. Is there anything you'd like to add about your book, like in relation to the discussion that we've been having?
So, well, we could talk about nihilism in relation to this, because in one way, sort of saying that science is not this authoritative figure sounds nihilistic, because people want to appeal to science as this sort of bulwark against relativistic nihilism. But at the same time, as Heidegger talked about, there is something very nihilistic about this sort of blind pursuit of technology for its own sake. So it's like, well, there's charges of nihilism that could be leveled on either side. Both of what I'm saying about there's something I wondered, and no one sort of held me up for this before, and I've been surprised whether people would say what I'm saying about science is problematic because it's sort of destabilizing, that we just need to retain this kind of authoritative position for scientific knowledge because it is the best that we have, and nothing should be said to undermine that, especially given all of the cultural war connotations, and also that the very prospect of people figuring out everything that there is to know about the natural world, not this generation, but future generations of humans, I think that gives many people kind of value for their own endeavors, and collectively that if human beings are just these evolved creatures lost on a planet spinning around the sun, but at least if we figure everything out, then that gives some meaning and status to our lowly existence in the universe. So to say that there is not that whatever we figured out is not the fundamental ultimate plan of the universe kind of undermines that value that many people do see crystallize.
But that the sort of classic nowadays Neil deGrasse Tyson view of spinning around on a rock.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree it's the case that let's say that sufficient knowledge comes to light, we understand everything, doesn't that negate itself, so that there's only meaning up to the point where you have anything to figure out? Once it's all figured out, what would that then would be nihilistic? I don't think your position is nihilistic, but I can see why people might think it's defeatist. There's certainly, there has to be mystery. Otherwise, what are you? So it all sounds a bit boring, doesn't it, without some element of mystery?
Yeah, but I think the world divides up into two kinds of people. Those that want there to be mystery and those that don't want there to be mystery. And I think the Neil deGrasse Tyson thing, yeah, if it does ever reach that vanishing point of everything finally all being figured out, then maybe people will be very bored and like, what do we do now? But that's not likely to happen. And just having this as a remote goal is extremely, I think, validating.
But what is it that they're trying to figure out, in your opinion?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but isn't it a recursive goal? You know, it's knowledge for its own sake at that point, because it's kind of paradoxically without the element of mystery that you're retaining within your own position.
No.
Is that sort of point that you can't get to, that you are trying to figure out. Whereas on the other side, if that isn't there, it's knowledge for its own sake.
Yeah. So that is, if you like, the contemplative ideal that we should have knowledge for its own sake. That Dewey said, oh, that's not what science is about anyway. And I tend to be skeptical that this thing that people are going after with the popular science explaining everything away approach to the satisfaction you get from that is not one that, okay, I just want to know how things are in that sort of disinterested, contemplative way. I look at that and think there's something different going on. It's more like not wanting to admit that one could not in principle control everything. So the more things get these popular scientific comprehensible explanations, it's like, aha, we people, we humans, there's nothing out there in nature that can beat us. Nature, you're just not very good at your tricks. We've got you figured out. So I think there is this conceit and this, quite oppositional attitude to the natural world that is embedded in that.
And yet it's still, I don't know. I think just because we delude ourselves, just because we figured something out by our own estimations and descriptions doesn't mean I think we conflate that we control it just because we can describe it.
Right, exactly. So this is sort of the counter charge. So the charge that my own position would be nihilistic would be to say that, well, this nihilistic thread on the other side, that's precisely what Heidegger called the nihilism of our technological era.
Do you see our technological advances, our technological sort of acceleration as a continuation of that line of thought? Of these are, let's say, materializations, like more robust, quite literal materializations of that scientific process when it has been conflated as control. That's what technology becomes, is instruments of understanding, where understanding is synonymous with control and some form of power.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of, I think it's often comes about through a kind of displacement of what would be sort of a deeper and more sympathetic knowledge of things, with that gets sort of set aside and displaced with this idea of, like, you can purely just manipulate something, and using that as a proxy for knowledge is something that actually bothered me when I was back studying the neurosciences, was how easily that could happen. So obviously a lot of neuroscience is ultimately geared towards applied research, which should have humanitarian, beneficial prospects of people with disorders with their brains. You could figure out some kind of intervention that would help them. But it struck me that many of those interventions sort of get discovered by happenstance. You find a way to sort of zap the brain and it works. Actually, deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's and for it's used also for OCD as an instance of this. It's just, you can stick electrodes in, and if you can move them around enough and twiddle the dial enough, you can find a setting that helps a person. But reading around some of the discourse and philosophy of neuroscience, not to name too many names, but there are some obvious ones. People would take if you like, wins or successes like that, and immediately leap to the story. Yes, and we know everything about the brain, and there's the neuroscience should replace all the other ways that we might have in investigating the human situation. So really making a huge leap from a technological intervention, which doesn't by itself reflect a huge degree of insight or understanding of a situation, and saying, aha, there's nothing left to know, and abandon all other ways of trying to know the mind and the human situation.
We do that with every technological iteration, though, it seems. We like to think we know.
Well, and I would say, if you're going to look at this in sort of this big historical trajectory, I mean, the thing that we confront with technologies as the ones that are always in the news today is AI, large language models, is that they're becoming more and more incomprehensible. And so sort of scary in that respect, like so much of discourse around them is like this big scary thing that's going to generate its own consciousness and exterminate us. But really, this seems like it's a projection of our own will to power onto these machines, and not realizing that there's something troubling about our own relationship to the world, our own relationship to control, that we are reading off those devices precisely as they become more opaque and actually less a vector of understanding than they ever were.
Are we embarrassed by AI that we project that it's able to do what we really wish we could do?
Maybe that's it.
Are you? I think AI is dreadful. I don't think it's anything. I think it's a pathetic. All I've seen is a sort of pathetic tool. I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
as a technology, what it does in terms of generating text at the length it does, of the coherence that it does, I find impressive. Just I wouldn't have thought 10 years ago that it would be able to do that. But when people say, "Oh, well, this is what we're doing when we write, and there's no point in writing anything anymore because you can just like press a button and the machine will do it," that I find is a massive overestimation of what is basically this kind of cultural averaging machine.
Well, I mean, this does directly relate to, because you're mentioning that earlier, that neuroscientific study is always going to be based off previous data, which in a sense is what AI is doing. It's always based off basically memory, which then brings, I mean, it's this sort of neat place to bring in God, technology, and epistemology, which is the difference between what an AI is doing solely with memory,
right,
and I guess we can go always back to Kant, with genius, and what human thoughts are doing when they are inspired or whatever it might be, what the difference is. And that seems to be in a place where mystery is brought in inherently, where,
right.
I mean, I don't know about you, I don't always know where my thoughts are coming from.
Yeah. Well, exactly, that the people, I would say the world divides up into two people, two kinds. They're the ones that don't like mystery, are the ones that sort of latch onto LLMs as saying, oh no, there's nothing mysterious about going on in your mind when you think up a sentence, because that's just what the machine does, and we know how it happens because at least we know the operating principles, even if we don't know the details of how it works. So using it as a way to sort of demystify the creative process of, if you had any like last remnants of belief in genius and the awe of works of art created by geniuses, and then you give that up now because we've got ChatGPT.
It's a shame that everything it makes is artistically, it's usually dreadful, but yeah. Do you, in that sense, do you see your book as hopeful? I mean, this is just the thought that's on my mind at the moment, right. But do you see it as hopeful? Because I see there's an inherent, with the limited, or with the nihilistic limitations that are brought about, I would say, argued by what we've just spoken about with regards to AI, It seems that your book in holding up mystery, especially in the face of science, is hopeful, is vital.
Yeah, I think it is for some people. I think for some readers that's what they take from it, and that I suppose to me is something that I connect with this position, is that once you sort of get over yourself, your own culturally instilled hubris about the limitless potential of human progress and conquest, that actually there's a better way of relating to the world that reveals itself.
Do you have a specific name for that way of relating to the world? Because that seems outside the realm of strictly epistemological method. It seems like it would be something else altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the way that is most accessible to most people, it would be an aesthetic way. So just, looking at not just the chaotic and complex and confounding things that are there in nature as sort of resisting conceptualizations, but actually having an order of themselves, which is beautiful, even if it cannot be mastered conceptually and technologically. And
sounds like Schopenhauer.
Right. Well, yeah, more optimistic than it. And then opening the door to saying, yeah, there is inherent order to things, and that's often something that is articulated in spiritual traditions as well. That it's not just that we have to come along and impose the order that we're most comfortable with, but actually discover that there's more order there than we can apprehend, but to reconcile ourselves with them.
Okay. So where do you go from here? If you've admitted to these limitations, what's next?
Yeah. What's next? In terms of what I'm doing research-wise at the moment, I got a grant last year to do research leave on topic related to this new buzzword in cognitive science, basal cognition, which is the idea that all living things to some extent have cognitive capacities. Most well-known figure amongst the scientists working in this area is Michael Levin. And he's an interesting one because there's something very neo-vitalist about this whole basal cognition field. In fact, if I was going to write a historical paper on this topic, it would be like, how much is basal cognition a recapitulation of what was actually meant, what the vitalists were going on about before they got castigated by people from that Helmholtz, Du Bois-Reymond's generation. But anyway, Michael Levin's is kind of neo-vitalist, but also very hardcore mechanist, transhumanist, basically technophile. So seeing this way of research as a way that you can cure all diseases and make people immortal, which remains to be seen. But I find it a really curious.
Hasn't happened to anyone yet.
And anyway, I don't mean to sound like he just goes on podcasts and just talks about immortality all the time. That would be an unfair characterization. And I think his science is really interesting as well. And other people in the field, I just mentioned him because his name is the one that your listeners are most likely to have heard of. There's loads of really good people working in this area, both in philosophy and in the scientific side. But yeah, a way of thinking about life, which sort of sees animation and intelligence as kind of pervading in life, which is really quite antithetical to that mechanist tradition in biology, which is what we've inherited from Descartes and others. Let's make Descartes the villain of everything. So you've got
and
yeah, and
I don't know. It's unfair. I think I will just say, because I'm very mean on Descartes as well, but it seems that it's the stereotype of the mind-body problem. So people don't usually get what Descartes meant by the mind-body split, right, on his own terms. But our understanding of the mind-body split that's come from Descartes has done a lot of damage. So.
Yeah. But yeah, the bit of villainy that I think he did relevant here is actually saying that, there is no sort of intelligence pervasive to living things. The mind is, in the human mind, is something sort of very disconnected from anything that you would find elsewhere in the living world. So actually connecting the idea that life happens through its own kind of intelligence, putting that back into modern biology, but then seeing, if you like, the techno-optimist cultural background that's there within modern biology is kind of shaping this basal cognition field in its own way, at least as it's presented by people like Levin.
Okay. Well, that sounds fascinating. So what is the project there? Is that another book, or is it just
no, I wrote a paper, I drafted a paper last year, which is on the concept of the non-cognitive. So when people assert that there is a minimal form of cognition that one finds across the board in living things, what is actually the contrast class of something like completely non-intelligent and non-cognitive, and arguing that it just goes back to the notion of quite a Cartesian mechanism, something that is merely reacting to what is most immediately impacting it.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically there'll be a few papers loosely related to this field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll be sure to put the links for your book in the description below, for The Brain Abstracted. How is it? How have people responded to it?
I've been pleased with the response, pleasantly surprised. I think as you're writing a long book, probably many people find this, like, deliberately keep expectations low. Like, you think so much of yourself into it, and the fear that people will hate it because there's something unlikable about you yourself that is that in 300 pages worth of text, or just stupid and incoherent. And so I set myself low expectations, and maybe just for that reason I've been pleasantly surprised that it's been so far well received, and I've been happy that different people from different walks of life and different academic backgrounds have taken something from it. And,
that's really good to hear. Well, I'll be sure to put the links for it in the description below. But that seems like a good place to finish up. So,
okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the conversation.